to Energy Bites with ELS. So this is our first episode of our weekly series, which will be held in English from now on and published on Mondays. We did one last week, which was in Swedish, but we will keep them in English from now on. We will talk about energy policy, markets and investments, and pretty much what will keep us busy at ELS the coming week. So with me I have Shana Casas.
Hello.
Siddharth Iyer.
Hey.
And Carl Rosenberg.
Pleasure to be here.
And my name is Elina Kinsey, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of ELS Analysis. I'll start with you, Shana. What's going on in the EU? A lot of focus on hydrogen. We did have a hydrogen week last week in the EU. So can you give us some updates about that?
Yeah, of course. So as you said, it was the Hydrogen Week in Brussels last week, and many complaints were raised regarding hydrogen infrastructure and market readiness. But on the policy side, stakeholders were they raised the issue of hydrogen regulation being overcomplicated. As you know, we have very strict rules, and this is indeed something that's undermining the takeoff of the sector. But you know that next week on Tuesday, the second hydrogen auction from the EU Hydrogen Bank, it's starting.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. We had a hydrogen auction earlier this year, and we've been following what's going on with these projects. We've been seeing, Europe has the second largest hydrogen funding budget, but we have seen very little sort of activities when it comes to going from idea to actually FID. So I was going to ask you first, sort of the results from that auction.
Yeah, exactly.
What kind of development has been happening?
So as you know, it was 5 projects that were awarded, 2 in Spain, 2 in Portugal, 1 in Finland and 1 in Norway. Actually, the grant agreements were signed beginning of last month with the EU, so the process are going to be quite slow. But one of the Spanish projects actually got the environmental permit this summer. So the construction will begin in the next 6 months, although the operation will start in 2027. And one of the Portuguese projects actually confirmed that they will start the FID process in June next year. So things are moving along, but a bit slower.
Slow, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So what about this new auction then? Are there any kind of new dates coming out from that?
Exactly. If you remember, the Hydrogen Bank auction has this new mechanism called Auction as a Service, which is a scheme that member states can sign up for and decide to allocate national funds to national projects that apply for this EU funding but are not awarded any grants. And last year, for the first auction, it was only Germany who did that. But for this time, we have Spain, Lithuania and Austria signing up for this too.
Okay, interesting. So on that investment side, what would you say then, Sid, on sort of the investment sentiment in general? That's something that we always follow. So on the renewable side, what's going on in Europe at the moment?
Yeah, of course, Elin. So generally speaking, investor sentiment in renewables is very much dependent on geography. Across Northern Europe and Northwestern Europe, there's quite a good market opportunity due to fairly high electricity prices. But the willingness to invest in different geographies in power generation differs quite a lot. Focusing for a moment on offshore wind, looking at the Eastern Baltic Sea, interest in different countries there has been varied. Looking at Lithuania, which has just restarted a tender process, interest there has been muted, especially because of very complicated auction design. And an earlier auction had to be cancelled because there wasn't enough investor interest. There was only one bid.
Yeah. Would we expect more interest this time? Because also we usually talk about, electricity prices can be high, but still you need that some kind of risk sharing or cost support from the state. So that's included in the Lithuanian auction design, right? But still interest been pretty low. So
that's right, yes, because there is the possibility of bidding for support from the state, but at the same time there's a possibility of negative bidding where the developer pays for the right to develop a site. And in fact, Lithuania is complicated by the fact that different sections of power production can have different kinds of bids, negative as well as support. So this complication means that it's very difficult for developers to make a decision towards that. So generally speaking, they would prefer to save their effort and spend it in other geographies where there's more.
And why would that be?
Well, Northwestern Europe, the continent, has quite a lot of opportunity, but one place which has really been coming up is France. So auction processes there are generally quite slow and protracted, taking several years, but recently there have been announcements of many gigawatts worth of power generation, close to 10, and in the upcoming auction now, there's been significant developer interest. 12 consortia and individual players have
I was going to
pre-qualified.
ask you about that, because we saw some negative news last week with European oil and gas companies coming out saying we are leaving, or we are withdrawing rather,
Yes.
from renewable projects, Total Energy being the one kind of not following that trend. But what kind of interest are we seeing? What kind of companies? Or you mentioned consortiums, so can you just elaborate a bit more on that?
Of course. So we at ELS have been saying for quite a long time that consolidation is the name of the game here in the offshore wind industry. And we're seeing that happen more and more, especially now in the French tender. Most of the pre-qualified bidders are consortia consisting of renewable specialist developers, large utilities, but also capital-rich investors that are going to fund the project. There are exceptions, as you mentioned. Total Energies and RWE are some of them, large utilities which can go in on their own. But mostly it takes the combined financial and technological capabilities of many players to pass the stringent pre-qualification criteria, as well as to actually develop the sites to completion.
Yeah, and we've seen some, focus on pre-qualifications and those kind of tendering processes in the Netherlands as well, Carl, right?
Yeah, and they just announced that they are opening 3 new sites. It was 4 originally, so that's, excuse my Dutch, but the Ilmoeden Vergamma and Nedervik, always the most pronounceable names. And as you mentioned, Elin, pre-qualification is definitely the name of the game there, with a heavy push for both environmental criteria but also grid reliability because of the high amount of renewables in the Dutch grid.
Yeah, but I would say that when we have a lot of focus on pre-qualifications, it's really when you see a market maturing, right? So when offshore wind is becoming a very integrated part of the electricity system as a whole.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, just wanted to say that these 3 sites that are being auctioned in the Netherlands are part of the 4 sites that were divided earlier this year due to financial reasons.
Oh, right. So you want to kind of increase the bankability of the projects. That's very interesting. So, but we are here in the Nordics, and we are laughing, but we should do something else instead, because things are going very slow here, and we had some pretty negative news coming out 2 weeks ago, but we've seen some reaction on the political side. So can you just, briefly just give us the background to what we are talking about? I think everyone been following the news about the 13 declined projects in the Baltic Sea. But then we've seen some reactions, or very strong reaction from the market when that happened, but then we saw some political sort of counter reaction to that last week. So can you just give us an update on that, Carl?
Definitely. As you and I discussed in the last podcast, our very much podcast debut, the government decided to restrict the southern and southeastern part of the Baltic Sea, citing defense reasons. So the market obviously reacted very strongly, since this decision was very abrupt. But now the government is trying to move forward. So last week, State Secretary Daniel Lilleberg and Energy Minister Ebba Busch gathered with representatives from the offshore wind sector to initiate discussions on how to enhance the contribution of intermittent power sources such as solar and wind to sort of strengthen the grid reliability and resource adequacy. So this is in line with 2 new joint initiatives that involves Svenska Kraftnät, the Swedish TSO, the Swedish Energy Market Inspectorate, and the Swedish Energy Agency. And the measures are designed to help renewable deployment, focusing on updated technical standards and creating new incentives. But the question is, how do you design these incentives? Will there be any risk distribution? Will it fall entirely on the developer, or will the government take on some responsibility to create a viable market?
Yeah, and we've seen, some developments this year with, especially focusing on nuclear, with FIDs being sort of investigated for that specific technology. But that could obviously also spill over on other technologies if the government wants to. And I think that's where the uncertainty lies here. We don't really know what kind of direction this government wants to push forward. And I think that's the uncertainty, even though we are seeing these dialogues and inquiries being sort of launched and so on. So I think that's what we talked about also last week, is that's the political risk here, the uncertainty that we don't know the long-term direction here. If we move away from long-term focus here to what's going on at the moment in the market, so can you say something about energy and commodity prices, Sid?
Yes, of course, Elin. So the last couple of weeks have been marked by surging gas prices, especially on the back of geopolitical risk. Gas prices are touching almost 50 euros per megawatt hour, which is essentially annual high levels. This comes on the back of US sanctions on Gazprom Bank, sparking fears in the market that Russian gas supply to Europe will be cut off. We already knew that Ukraine does not wish to renew a transit agreement from the beginning of next year, but this development adds on to the risk. It stacks onto multiple geopolitical risks, which has led to the market responding very quickly and very spooked.
Yeah, so it's a jumpy market, more or less. I think, the transit contract or those volumes not coming through Ukraine was already priced in, but obviously now the market becomes very kind of jumpy in that way. So
yes,
what about sort of fundamentals? Prices been going up also because of, colder weather, obviously. We are in the winter season, but would be interesting to just hear, what about gas storage? That's always the level you keep your eye on during this time of the year. So how are they doing? Yeah,
very much so. Gas storage is, for the time of year, at its lowest levels since 2021. But it's still about 90% full. Of course, withdrawals are quite fast given the cold weather, and gas storage, even if full, is not enough to help Europe tide over the winter, even in the case of a cold spell.
Yeah, of course not.
So
depending on imports from both Russia and the LNG, so
very much so. That's Europe depends on that. So gas and power prices can spike quite a lot in that regard.
Yeah. So have we seen any movements then in the electricity prices? We see electricity prices obviously trading very close to gas prices this time of the year, but how's they been doing?
Yeah, in fact, there have been quite a lot of price spikes in southern Sweden, which is connected, of course, to Germany.
Yeah.
This is quite normal for this time of year. But one point that bears noting is the recent introduction of flow-based market coupling within the Nordic region.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussions and comments and critiques about that in all the channels that we are following. Yeah. So, give us a view on that.
Right, absolutely. So, as a quick recap, flow-based market coupling was introduced in the Nordics last month, and this system has been used in continental Europe already for nearly 10 years, but is a new system for the Nordics. Its introduction has been heavily criticized even before implementation, with the idea that prices for Swedish consumers, especially in southern Sweden, would be higher due to the nature of the implementation. And as of now, we are seeing that prices in southern Sweden are quite elevated above its neighboring zones. But one thing which hasn't really materialized is an increase in price in northern Sweden to a great extent. There have been some spikes on some days, but largely there's still congestion between the north and south, leading to a large price difference. One thing which does stand out, however, is the price difference between southern Swedish SE3, where there's Stockholm and Gothenburg, and Norway, NO1, where Oslo is located. Although these two neighboring bidding zones do not always have transmission congestion between them, there's still a noticeable price difference between the two.
Before flow-based was introduced, there was a lot of discussion about trade, especially in between Sweden and Norway. Have we seen a trade decrease in between Sweden and Norway?
One thing that flow-based has led to is more efficient use of transmission lines based on the physical realities of the grid in real time. So one of the most criticized elements is that the Norwegian generation is transmitted through Sweden to be delivered to Norwegian customers.
So it's more of a, what can you call it, like a hedging strategy from Norwegian players then?
Yeah. But it's not purely financial. It's also in the sense that the grid is being utilized to the advantage of trade. And ideally speaking, its efficient use of the grid should lead to the best market outcomes for everyone in the sense of, even if there are high power prices in some locations, those should incentivize investment into power generation in those locations. And where there is congestion, then it should be incentivized to build out the grid there. But bringing back the conversation to the political risk, even though southern Sweden has higher prices now, investment into generation here is not going forward at the rate that it needs to, precisely because there's such a difficulty in managing the risks.
And so that's the bigger picture, and I do think that with flow-based, we still haven't really wrapped our head around what that means. And I think a lot of the criticism have also been about the transparency. So even for those sitting there and trading in this market, they don't really understand what's going on or how to work around this. And I think we will end with those words, because I think that's been something that, been coming across from everything from hydrogen to offshore wind tendering procedures, but now also market movements and new sort of introductions of new systems. Is lack of transparency is a huge problem at the moment, and that also has a huge effect on the efficiency.
Definitely.
For investments to really find its right place.
Without transparency, how are you going to mitigate conflicts, right?
So I mean, that's something that we've been talking a lot about, like how is that interlinked with the new political risk. The political risk has not only to do with like the traditional geopolitical risk, but more to do with the way the bureaucracy and the way all different systems are being carried out.
Speaking about that, I mean, investors in the Czech Republic are suing the government because of retroactively withdrawing subsidies for solar developments. I mean, we're seeing heightened political risks in not only nuclear markets such as Sweden, but also potential nuclear markets in the Czech Republic.
Yeah, that's very interesting. We'll see if EU will do something about that.
Let's see.
Okay. So let's wrap this up. Some final remarks from everyone. What do you think we'll talk about on Monday next week?
Yeah, we'll be following the reaction ahead of the EU hydrogen auction, and hopefully more countries squeeze in this week the announcement of them joining the auction as a service mechanism.
Okay, we will see. What about you, Sid?
We'll be watching the expected continuous volatility in the energy markets, not only commodity prices because of rapid geopolitical movements, but also shifting investor sentiments from quick political changes.
Yeah.
And on the Swedish front, I'm going to continue on the offshore wind route, looking at the offshore wind inquiry that is set to be released on the 30th of November. So going to be following that along with you.
Okay, thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much.
And see you next Monday.
See you next Monday.
See you next Monday.
See you.